Hey everyone, this time we read Beyond Donkey Kong by Ken Horowitz. So while the focus is on Nintendo's arcade games from the 70s and 80s, it does cover a lot of Nintendo's history, up from its original beginnings all the way until about the present time. There are a few games in here which I didn't know really existed or I didn't know too much about, so it was really nice to read about those. And it was also really nice to read a little bit about the conversion kits. So if you already know about Nintendo's history, there's not going to be a whole lot of new things in here. If you don't know too much about their coin-op origins, then you're going to learn a few new things from this. For the most part, this is going to repeat a lot of information that you've heard in other places, especially early on. Once you hit about the middle, probably like 120, 130 pages, a lot of that might be sort of newer information for some people, especially once it gets past Donkey Kong and gets into some of the Versus cabinets, and even a few of the original cabinets which were released prior to Donkey Kong. So the book does start out with Nintendo's origins, as I've said. It goes through this pretty quick, and Ken does a good job of getting you to the arcades in a pretty timely fashion in this book. Once you get there, you kind of learn that Nintendo was sort of struggling to find its first really big hit, and you get to find out a bunch of the games that led up into Donkey Kong. And then, of course, he goes into Donkey Kong, but he adds more into this. And there are a few things that I didn't necessarily know about the game, or really the two sequels that came after it. Let's kind of go into those a little bit more. So the big thing that I learned about when I was reading Ken's book, especially on Donkey Kong, was that there were 3 lawsuits going on concerning Donkey Kong. Most people know about the Universal lawsuit, where Universal Studios tried to sue Nintendo because they claimed that they owned the right to King Kong, and they thought Donkey Kong might be infringing on it. The other one I didn't know about was Crazy Kong, and that was a Nintendo licensed clone that was only supposed to be released in Japan, but as Ken explains, it found its way to the US, and was the subject of a lawsuit as Nintendo was trying to protect their copyright. While protecting their copyright, Ken kind of theorizes that Donkey Kong Jr. was a way to sort of separate really the first game from the sequels to protect themselves, really. So Nintendo is getting sued also by another company that actually did all of their programming for them. And they kind of use Donkey Kong Jr. as a way to say, hey, look, this is a little bit different from the original code that we had. We kind of built on it a little bit. That sort of thing. He continues on with that theory to say a similar thing about Donkey Kong 3, how that was even more different from the first two. You can see how in Donkey Kong they have the platforming and jumping sort of down pretty well, and in Donkey Kong Jr. they kind of expanded upon that. Then you get to Donkey Kong 3, and it's totally different from the other two. It's a combination of space shooter and platformer, and it's a little weird, to be honest. I actually like Donkey Kong 3 more than the other two, just because of how different it is. I'm actually terrible at all 3 of them, but I really like Donkey Kong 3. He also points out how Donkey Kong 3 was only released on conversion kits, and this was something that Nintendo was trying to use in order to get around really having to settle with some of the craziness that was happening in the arcade industry at the time. The conversion kit was really kind of a growing trend in the arcade industry, as Ken explains. People were seeing that the arcade machines weren't lasting very long, and they wanted to find a way to cheaply replace them. And Sega and a few other companies came up with this conversion kit. From here he transitions into talking more about the video game crash, and expanding a little bit on some of the arcade history in general. I think Ken does a really good job of explaining the arcade business in the wake of the video game crash in 1983. This was something I really didn't know too much about. I knew that arcades were kind of getting hit a little bit prior to the video game crash, and seeing what happened to them afterwards was really interesting. We also get to see a little bit of what Nintendo is doing to try to get around some of the problems with the video game crash. Ken explains that it wasn't a problem for like the game players or the consumers. It was mostly a problem with kind of the people that were getting the games from the publishers to the consumers, kind of like that middleman retail area. They were the ones who were having problems because they had all this inventory that they just couldn't get rid of, and they started sending it back to the publishers and everything like that. It's at this point that we see Nintendo kind of moving away from the arcade market, and they sort of move more in line with like their home console with the Famicom and everything that's going to come from that. Along with the Famicom, you got to see the Versus cabinets, which I thought were really, really interesting. I had only really heard of one Versus cabinet, and that was Versus Balloon Fight, but to read about Versus Tennis, Versus Baseball, and Versus Wrecking Crew, that was really cool to really find out more about those games, because one, I didn't really know about them, but let's kind of talk a little bit more about the Versus cabinets really quick.
The Versus cabinets were a series of arcade cabinets that Nintendo released where you could basically compete with a friend at the arcades while playing the same game. You would have two separate monitors, two separate controls and everything, and you could kind of compare how you're doing with your partner or with whoever happened to be playing against you at that time. It was a really cool idea, and it worked pretty well for Nintendo. Also, what they would do is they would sell conversion kits for these, so you could have up to about 2 or 3 games in one cabinet at a time. There were a bunch of these, like Balloon Fight and Wrecking Crew. There was also a Mario, there was a tennis, there was a soccer, there was a baseball. There were just a whole bunch of these. And they were kind of like the precursors to the Play Choice 10 a little bit, where you just got to see a bunch of games that would end up on the Famicom or on the NES at some point. It's here that Ken starts talking about what Nintendo really had with this type of an arcade system. They would basically have a test market for future console games. And they just really worked very well with like the Game & Watch and with the console, where you would find a game in the arcades, it might get filled in on its story in the Game & Watch, or it might have started on the Game & Watch, made it to an arcade, and then made it onto the Famicom. It was just a really cool concept that Nintendo had, and they did very well with this format.
One thing I noticed was that the Game & Watch series kind of helped foster some of these titles, and it really kind of filled in some of the gaps for when there was a story. He talks about Donkey Kong Circus, kind of giving Donkey Kong a reason to dislike Mario. We get to find out about a few of the other games. Like with Wrecking Crew, there was a Game & Watch game that was similar to that, and it was Mario's Cement Factory. It's just kind of cool to see all of these and how they played a part in both the arcades and the console games to come. So getting to read a little bit more about the Game & Watch games I thought was really interesting. They do play a role in Nintendo's Famicom and in their arcades, so it was just really interesting to get to read about those, and I'm really glad that Ken included that in here. So while there is a lot of information in here, I just kind of felt that he ran out of stuff to talk about in the arcades, like after probably like the 160, 170 page point. It was just sort of weird to have it mostly talk about Nintendo's arcade games, and then have it kind of move into like arcade ports and that sort of thing, where Nintendo had very clearly left the arcade industry by the 90s, but were still talking and the book's continuing to go. It was still interesting to read, but I was sort of like, I'm starting to lose how this really ties into the arcades. I feel like if there was more of a focus on a lot of the earlier arcade games really in the 70s and 80s, and that just would have helped me out a lot more with this book. I didn't necessarily need to know a lot about the stuff that was happening in the really 90s and into the 2000s, and it just kind of felt a little bit out of place to me. If I could really only say one bad thing about this, it's that it just kind of seemed to keep going when it really didn't necessarily need to keep going. It's a really great book, it just sort of for whatever reason, just felt a little bit longer than it had to be. So anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everyone.